Hi, thank you so much for coming back to another episode of Unlocking Venture Capital. So I'm here with Heather, and she's a founding partner at a great emerging fund. So I'm so excited to get to talk to her and about her vision. So Heather, please tell us about your fund and please tell us about what keeps you busy these days.
Thank you very much for having me, first of all. So Alwyn Capital we're an early stage fund. So we invest our first checks usually in a pre-seed stage company. We look for technologies that are mitigating a worldwide reliance on animals. So we're looking for underrepresented founders that are coming up with biotechnology solutions to feed, clothe, and care for 10 billion people. And we are really kind of looking at this holistically, right? Where, we've got a growing human population, we have finite resources on our planet, and we also are facing a climate crisis. So we need to come up with different solutions that will help keep our population and our world healthier longer. And we believe that biotechnology is the key to innovation. So we're looking for anything that will help, kind of transition people away from eating a lot of animal protein or using large amounts of animal-based materials. We're trying to come up with things that are alternative protein-based, alternative materials-based, and then medical technology that is more based in human relevant research.
Absolutely. And, Heather herself has been such an advocate for animal protection and has been a vegan for over 2 decades. So this is such a great, perfect mesh for what you do and you're passionate about and about your life. So when you have really dove into your work here and investing in this space, what would you say were like the biggest things that kind of surprised you, like in terms of stats or the way the market is or trends were? Was there anything that particularly were eye-opening for you? And how did you personally kind of react to that?
Well, I'd say to start, I started investing in this space about 8 years ago, and I was actually super excited about all the different types of products that were on the market, people using technologies that were based in, pharmaceutical development to create things like food or functional ingredients. So I was excited about that and surprised. And then, I think going forward, we lived through kind of the pandemic moment where people were really paying attention to what they were eating, what they were putting inside their bodies, and thinking about how their personal consumer choices really affected our climate and our planet broadly. And we saw a spike in people, transitioning to more plant forward eating or really thinking about kind of where their food was coming from. And since then, I think everybody has gotten, back into their routines. And so we've seen sales in the plant-based space specifically kind of flatline over the last, I'd say 18 months. So I was surprised by that because I thought that, those kinds of experiences, people really paying attention to health and climate were going to be long lasting. But I forget that, consumers are they get stuck in routine, they get busy, they have busy lives. They're thinking just about how they can kind of like feed their families affordably. And so I think that that's something for the alternative protein space in particular really to pay attention to is like, where are we meeting consumers with where they need products, right? Do they taste right? Are they priced right? Are they consistently convenient? So I think that's been a learning moment for the entire industry.
Yeah, that's absolutely surprising to me too when I heard about this trend and how like people's food and diet, because I'm so interested in reading how people eat, were kind of going back against the way that I kind of predicted as well. I completely understand what it's like to be really busy and having your proactive choices in what you put in your body just be on the back burner, you know what I mean? And that's really tough, especially when it comes to habits and things like that. For like 3 days last week, all I ate were bagels because all I did was and everything because that's all they fed me were New York bagels. I was like, I
I
guess
mean, there are worse things to eat than New York bagels,
I know.
I mean,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. So speaking more about the portfolio company side, the startup and venture side, were there any kinds of startups that you would say, believe that they should be in your portfolio or should be in this space? But digging a little bit further, doing a bit more due diligence, as you're like, okay, this is not exactly the right thesis, or you have the right intention, but the execution just doesn't really kind of fit into this mission. And kind of how did you, approach that from an investor side?
So I think probably the first thing that comes to mind when we're thinking about this, right? We've got exposure in three different verticals. So we've got food, fashion, and pharmaceuticals, we say. It's not quite that simple. It's really food ingredients, right? We're looking at alternative protein ingredients, alternative fats, things like that. We've got material companies that are developing, transitionary materials for automobile industry or for high value luxury goods that are more sustainable than leather. And then in the pharmaceutical industry, we're looking for alternatives that will bring drugs to market faster for human patients.
Yeah.
So in the food space specifically, cultivated meat is one of those things that has played a pretty big role in our portfolio. The technology itself is super nascent. So this is a very, very young industry. I mean, there's been less invested in the entire industry than there has been in one EV battery facility. So, I mean, just on scale, like it might sound like a lot of money has been invested, but it's really very little.
Yeah.
And so the industry as a whole is very young. And initially, we saw a lot of what we call vertically integrated companies. So companies doing everything from building and designing their own facilities, sourcing and producing their own media formulations, growing and optimizing their own cell lines. And so they were doing everything from start to finish all along the value chain, figuring out how to get a product to market and then how to distribute that product. I think that right now what we're seeing is a lot of companies are laser focused on one part of that industry. So they're either looking just at being a media formulation company, they're looking at just developing cell lines, they're looking at just bioprocess engineering. And so I think that we've seen a shift in the market. The one thing that we haven't gotten comfortable with yet is a company kind of coming out of the gate and saying that they are a cultivated meat producer. So they're sourcing cell lines from one company, they're sourcing media from another, and they are basically just producing a cultivated meat product to sell to either retail or food service. I don't think we've gotten, we've had some regulatory wins. The US has given, the FDA has given the green light to sell 2 different kinds of cultivated chicken into the market. And we've seen that also that companies have gotten regulatory approval in Europe as well. But broadly, I don't think one, consumers are ready for it yet. And 2, I don't think the industry is just ready for it yet. So that's the one thing that we really wanted to invest in some of these companies, but we just couldn't get over the line because we didn't think that the consumer base was really there yet.
I did research and a due diligence on, those cell-based meat products in the past. And as someone who's never had it before, because they didn't sell it in our market, and someone who's never seen it before, it took so much deep dive to be like, okay, what's the life science research on this? What is the scientific research on this? Like, well, how does this happen? And because going through like slides, even as a generalist investor, was just so nuanced and so kind of specific. And you did have to do a lot of deep diving. So in terms of, and other markets, they get things a little bit later from innovative markets like the US. So in terms of how you're kind of seeing that market adoption and what kind of obstacles that might be in your way as an investor and as you're supporting your portfolio companies across borders, are there anything in particular that you see as like, okay, these are flags that I'm going to have to deal with in the near future?
I mean, regulatory environment is huge, right? I mean, we've seen pushback from, individual states outlawing the sale or production of cultivated meat. So I'm just specifically talking about the cultivated meat industry right now. We got the FDA green light for 2 products over the course of the last 2 years. Europe has greenlit some products as well, but we've seen considerable pushback on the state level. And I think that some of that has to do with the political environment in our country. And a lot of countries, look kind of to the US to be the first mover in some of these approvals, like FDA process, right? I mean, novel foods in the UK is a different type of process, but here in the US, like, you can kind of get GRAS status and self approve yourself for GRAS, and you put your package forward, and FDA says, okay, no questions, and so that means that you can move forward and sell into the industry. The thing I think that's interesting is that there's a lot more innovation that's happening in Asia specifically, but the regulatory environment hasn't quite yet been worked out there. We saw, cultivated chicken actually go on market in Singapore for the first time. They were the world leader, first time that had ever been sold in a consumer environment. And so they were really leading the charge, I think, partly because they have food security issues, right? They're really thinking about how are they going to feed a growing population on a finite land mass without access to a significant part of, farmland. In the US, we have the opposite problem. We've got a lot of farmland. We also have a growing population, but we also have to be really considerate about our natural resource use. So I think different countries come at this from different levels. The US is definitely looked to be the first to approve some of these newer technologies. But I think that Asia is going to really lead the charge as far as when we're going to see innovation and development. So I think that that's kind of where we're looking to next to see a lot of the movement in the industry.
Do you guys invest outside of the US currently,
We
or?
do.
Okay,
Yep.
that's fantastic.
Yeah, we do. We're a global fund.
Yeah.
It was, there's a lot of innovation happening in alt protein in the US, but the growing middle class in Asia and the population in Asia is really where a lot of this innovation is being pushed forward from both a food security and an environmental perspective. So I think that there's a lot of stuff happening in
Yeah,
the
I
Asian
mean,
market.
yeah, and especially it's such a different kind of shift too. I remember going to a barbecue pork house and the I was getting something for my grandparents. And the question the lady asked me was, how old is the person who's eating it? And I'm like, that's a weird question. And she goes, that will tell me the fat content that I know they want in this. I'm like, what does that mean? So it was just kind of like understanding the culture where even your sauces have meat products in it, you know?
Mhm.
And so kind of taking a step back and being like, okay, well, how do we kind of provide that for an aging population where, X percentage, like sometimes over 80% of this Asian country is only like older people. And how do you kind of, re-educate that kind of habit into something that is a healthier or better, more sustainable lifestyle that is more mission forward and just better for everyone in general. And so would love to kind of see what's going to come out of your portfolios and the work that you do in the future in those areas.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point though. Like food is cultural, right? It's cultural and it's kind of time-based, right? I mean, people that grew up in the 1950s eat very differently or did eat differently than we do today. And a lot of people that, grew up, you know, three, four generations previous have different eating habits than folks that are in their 20s today as well, right? They have different considerations. And so I think that transitioning people really means paying attention to what they want, right? So you have to make those products and make that transition as easy for folks as possible. Give them something that they know how to cook, something that they know what it's supposed to taste like, or something
Yeah.
that they're at least familiar with, right? You can't expect someone to come and just completely change their eating habits overnight. So food is, what we say is like food is sticky, food is cultural. People transition very, very slowly. And so I think that understanding your consumer and understanding how your product fits into market is incredibly important. And then there's also the piece about, consumer education, rightfully to your point, how do you educate these consumers to make better choices? So these are all things that we're thinking about every day.
Are these personal conversations you've ever had with like your older relatives or grandparents or things
Totally.
like that? How did that kind of go about in your culture? Just wanted to know.
So not well. Um, I was born in Northern Ireland, grew up on meat and potatoes, and was the first one in my family to become vegetarian. And I think the first time I told my family that, they kind of looked at me as if I'd grown a third head. So it was not something that was really done. I mean, we were a farming family. Everybody kind of like lived off the land. Animals were part of that whole agricultural system.
Yeah.
And then trying to talk to folks about, like eating more plants or cutting down on saturated fat or, maybe making a meatless Monday choice or something, just eating less meat. I was completely against the culture that I had grown up in. So
Wow. That is
those
interesting.
conversations did not go well initially.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's so funny. It reminds me of those kinds of like Thanksgiving moments where you like break news to your family because that's just when you happen to see them.
Right.
And tell them this amazing news. So that's really funny. And in terms of your work and kind of where you guys are going to next and in the future, I would love to learn about kind of your co-investment strategies. So by that I mean I'm an industry agnostic investor, as I've told you, and we have to look at things as a whole. Like what does the market look like? What does your growth rate look like? What does this look like? So in terms of white spaces, it's always, extra research, extra due diligence to fully understand, right? So in terms of when you work with other co-investors that are more in an industry agnostic space, don't have the same background as you, probably don't have the same lifestyle as you, is there kind of that level of education or of that leadership or, of these kinds of ways to work with people to be like, no, this is the white space that we're looking at. This is the gap in the market that we need to focus on today, because I understand that some mission driven, funds kind of have a little bit of a struggle in that area. But did you ever find that in your line of work, or that kind of education level to just make sure everyone's in the same playing field?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've spent a lot of time talking about cultivated meat, but the one example that comes to mind is really, so there's two. There's one in cultivated meat, and then there's one in alternative materials. So I'll start with the cultivated meat one first, right? So we had a generalist investor that was coming on. We'd invested in a pre-seed round in an early stage company that was working on cultivated seafood.
Yeah.
And part of the thing that got us, that was able to help me get them over the line, was like, look, this is a long-term investment, right? The industry has not yet been kind of like fleshed out. But the one thing that this company has the advantage on is they're not selling into, they're going to market with a product that is a premium product. They were cultivating, so shellfish. So lobster was their first product, right?
Oh, that's a
And
hard product to do.
it's a hard product. Yeah, it's a huge, it's both
Wow.
hard from like a cell line development perspective, and
Uh-huh.
it's also, it's a premium price point, which gave them an advantage. They were incorporated in the Midwest with some of the cheapest utilities in the country, access to talent. And so I think that one of the things that we were able to do with this investor was like, look at this from a product development perspective, what the team has done early on to really get themselves positioned in a way that they can succeed, and then also de-risk the market by their first product that's going into market is going to be at a premium price point, and people that are buying lobster are expecting a premium price point. And so there's not a lot of that, we have to compete with like commodity prices on chicken or ground beef or something like that, right? And so, yeah, there was a certain amount of kind of educating them what a milestone looks like in cultivated meat development, because it's, can you get your media costs down 10x in the first 6 months? Can you get your cell line developed to go through 100 passages in the first year?
Yeah.
So those types of things that were like, this investor wasn't really super familiar with, but we were able to kind of get them over the line. So it was a certain amount of education of like, what are the milestones in the industry? What
Mm.
does the go-to-market strategy look like? And how has this company de-risked their technology and their approach? And then in the material space, we invested in a company called Uncaged Innovations based in upstate New York. And they're developing a grain-based alternative leather. And it's not fully plastic free
Okay.
yet, but they are moving towards being plastic free. That is, 100% their North Star, right? And I think a lot of the luxury and automobile industry wants a plastic free alternative today, but it doesn't perform. And so getting some of those later stage investors invested early to help them grow to a point where they can deliver a product that delivers on feel, on performance, it goes through all the right flex valley test or abrasion tests, and then also has an eye towards getting to completely plastic free. It's kind of one of those things. It's like, we see the innovation, we see the opportunity. We're maybe 5 years away from getting a product to market that delivers on across all of those things and also at the right price point. But that's like, seeing the vision and understanding where we're going is really, that's the number one important kind of like strategy that we have. Like, we've got to believe in the technology and our ability to deliver.
It almost sounds like you have to like work twice as hard as like any other fund manager to make sure that this makes sense for everybody at the table, and that you're not kind of too far ahead because you're so ingrained in this industry already.
I think every fund manager has to deal with that. Don't you think? I mean, like, you have to believe in the entrepreneur, you have to believe in the vision, and you have to believe that we're creating a product that, even if you aren't an impact driven fund, but that will make an impact on the world from an economic perspective, because you've got to be able to make money at the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah. There was a deal back home that I was not personally involved with, but it was in the impact and food space. And so what happened was that after R&D, after raising like a small amount of funding in order to kind of go forward and be able to be close enough to commercialization, they were offered an M&A from an incumbent, right? And then you don't know, as in I could not see that this actually ever came to market, because it was almost like this was going to be a direct competitor versus it could be innovative to the M&A buyer kind of a thing. So have you kind of seen those kinds of situations where you're like, no, I invested in this innovation and I wanted to come to market, but this other buyer, XYZ, are coming into play and, offering these kinds of deals? How do you go about advising the entrepreneur, which directions to go? Of course, they would come back and ask the investors who've kind of seen what beginning to end looks like. but is the end kind of the end that they're visualizing as well?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the IPO market had kind of, I mean, it might be getting back on track, but that wasn't an
Not
exit
there.
opportunity
Yeah.
for folks, right?
Yeah.
So you have to look at a strategic as kind of a partner for follow-on investment and then a potential acquisition down the line. And especially in the food space, because so many of these food giants, have access to distribution channels that can cut costs. They've got the customer base already worked out. And so they have trusted partnerships that can really be a value add for a young company that's looking to enter into a market and grow their business. And maybe they've got the tech worked out, maybe they've got scale worked out, but they don't have the same level of benefit from getting like feedstock prices down that say like, a large food producer would have, or the distribution to get into these broader markets that a larger food company would have. So I think that getting comfortable with like what is the incumbent's value add to this company, and yeah, we want to see the tech go the whole way, right? But if there's a way for this company to get their product to market for a cheaper price point, lower their cogs, get increased distribution and start making considerable money and impact in this space, it feels like it's a win from that perspective. So yeah, it's always a trade-off, right? Like you want to see the company IPO on the New York Stock
Yeah.
Exchange, but you also want to make sure that the technology survives and that it gets into the right hands to make the most impact and the most economic impact as well.
Absolutely, because otherwise, they've already signed all the papers. They can't actually do another company or product in that space anymore
Right.
because they
Right.
competitive to themselves. So that makes it really, really tough in those decisions too. I'm not jealous of those kinds of. So speaking of, this market that we're in right now, this is always a really interesting question to me. So as you know, I came from a family office fund, and so therefore I never raised a fund, and that's not news. That's how all family offices are like. So as someone who is in a mission-driven fund, did you find that the way that the market and the landscape is now, which is that LP money is not flowing the same way that it was a few years ago. Fundraising is taking a lot longer than it used to. First time fund managers, second time fund managers, or even seventh time fund managers are having a bit of a tough time retaining the LPs or getting new kind of investments in. So I was just wondering, do you find it to be the same challenges as other fund managers that are out in the market right now, or do you find the landscape to be different in terms of better or worse because you have a more specific mission, and kind of how does that come into play in these times?
I mean, I think if you talk to any fund manager, any company that's raising funding right now, it's a challenging environment, right? But I think it's a good challenge. I think that they're, especially in the alternative protein material spaces, and this may be applicable to like AI companies right now. There were a lot of generalist investors that came in with a lot of capital that really drove valuations up and made it quite easy to raise subsequent funding rounds at increased valuations. And it may not have been supported by business fundamentals.
Yeah.
And I think that now in this environment, like even though it is more challenging to raise funding, the right companies get the funding, the right fund managers get the funding. And I feel strongly that the cohort of investments that will be made in 24, 25, 26 are going to be really strong companies built on solid fundamentals. And I think that that's the one thing that we'll see. Like, there's a lot of companies that have been going out of business. There's a lot of companies that have been sort of like merger acquisitions in quotation marks. But I think moving forward, we're going to see the industry, get reset, valuations more reasonably appraised. And I think that it will make the industry as a whole healthier. And that goes across all venture, except of course, maybe AI, because that's where the bubble is right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's such a refreshing thing to say. I don't think anyone's said that to me, that the right people, the right founders, and the right, fund managers are getting the funding right now. And I think that
Yeah.
really does speak volumes and how people used to build business fundamentals versus how they're building it right now. And that's something that, more conservative markets like the ones that I'm from have always thought that was very normal. And so it's just really great to hear that. And I love that. So most of our audience, most of our listeners are venture capitalists. There are a large minority that are emerging VCs. So I'm sure that this is a question they always ask me. So I want to ask you, do people have to turn vegan to work for your fund?
Nope.
Okay, great. what are the top skills that you would advise on someone who is new to VC and either want to be part of something that is much more mission driven, something that is more values driven, and that speaks to them a little bit more?
Well, I mean, broadly, top skills become a really good read of people, especially if you're investing in the early stage, because a lot of times that's all you've really just got. Can this person deliver? And your determination of whether or not that's actually true is kind of like the number one. You'll get to know fastest if you can answer no to that question, and you're going to save yourself a whole lot of time. So I'd say try and hone your people reading skills. You know, my full disclosure, my fund partner is a much better read of people than I am. I focus more on the technology. I focus on, you know, the financial model. Can this work? Will this scale? Is the market there? And he pays attention more to, is this the right team to do it? And honestly, we have avoided a number of probably bad deals because
Mm,
he had the right read on those founders. So that would be my number one, broadly speaking, skill. Number two, I mean, if you're passionate about an industry, just really dive in, read everything you possibly can on that specific topic. There's tons of good information out there on alternative protein through Good Food Institute. If you're interested in Material Innovation Initiative, they have some great resources. So just, you know, if you're a data nerd like I am, embrace it.
amazing. Awesome. Thank you so much, Heather, for coming on to our podcast. And thank you, everyone, for joining in on another episode of Unlocking Venture Capital.
Thanks so much, Sydney.